Okay, well, hello everyone and welcome to our July at Home. This month we are celebrating specifically student research and just research in general. So what we have was two wonderful speakers who will be talking to you about their ongoing research. And then very sadly, our last speaker had to cancel at the last minute because they were due to be flying back from New York in time to present, and then the flight got changed. And as I was explaining to our speakers who have made it, I did think about asking them to present from the airport and then realised that was rather an unreasonable request. So they're hopefully going to come and join us at a later session. It gives us all the more time to hear from Jo and Deirdre about what they're doing, and also to finish off today's event with a very friendly invitation for anyone who wants to share what they're working on now. It doesn't have to be a piece of academic research or a huge monograph. It could be something you've seen on TV and want to copy, something you've always wanted to read. It can be textile related, it can be fashion related, it can be very tangential. Also, any questions you have, if you're struggling to find sources or you've just stumbled across the most amazing resource, that's always great to hear from, or a wonderful museum that you've never been to before, but you're actually thinking, oh, wow, everyone should go there. So we'll finish with that very friendly exchange of ideas, and we will share what we're working on as well, very honestly, if we're struggling, which we are in my case. And so without further ado, I am going to introduce our first of two speakers. As normal, just before I start, I should explain each paper will have opportunity for questions afterwards, and Anna will be leading those questions. So if you could pop any questions that you want to put to the speakers into the chat, either as they're speaking or once they've finished, we will make sure they get passed on. Brilliant. Okay. So I'm very pleased to welcome our first of two speakers today, which is Jo, who will be speaking to us about the material culture of the needlework of Cheltenham Female Orphan Asylum. And Jo is currently studying a master's by research at the University of Gloucestershire on the needlework, as you might have gathered, of the Cheltenham Female Orphan Asylum. Her research is currently being exhibited in the Holst Victorian House Museum in Cheltenham as a series of interventions to the display that elevates the narrative of the orphanage and the role of lady's maid, which the girls were being trained for. She also works as a freelance community artist and teacher, working on textile projects around Gloucestershire, including managing the Threads Festival as part of the work of Voices Gloucester. She's a lifelong stitcher and maker of things, as will become apparent today. So I'm going to hand over to you now, Jo, and we're really looking forward to hearing from you.
Thank you very much, everybody. Can everybody hear me okay?
Perfectly, thank you.
So thank you very much for coming along this afternoon. And as in the introduction, I'm going to talk to you about my research and exhibition. I've got some slides to share, so I'll just get those in. Hopefully everybody can see those now. So yes, I'm going to talk to you about my research, which I've been undertaking with the University of Gloucestershire. I'm doing an MA by research on Cheltenham Female Orphan Asylum and the needlework that they've produced. I'm an enthusiastic maker of things. I've got projects I should be stitching, never know which way to point, here for Threads Gloucester that we're working on at the moment. I work with a lot of community groups in participatory arts, and I'm just a lifelong embroiderer and textile enthusiast. So my talk this afternoon is about the needlework that I have been discovering, and it's now within an exhibition. So this is the first sampler to show you. This is a 19th century sampler from the Cheltenham Female Orphan Asylum, and it's approximately 15 centimetres, 6 inches square. These things are really quite small. And although it's called a sampler, it doesn't contain all the normal characteristics for an embroidery of that type. You can see from the image that it doesn't have a name or a date. It doesn't have an alphabet set out. It doesn't have any motifs. The only words on there are the Cheltenham Female Orphan Asylum, the only name there. It does have the usual pious and religious motto on there, but this time it's in the form of an acrostic. So to understand it, you need to start at the centre of the image with the black letter I, and from there, the phrase, "I die to live forever," radiates out in all directions. It's completed with tiny cross stitch on fine muslin. It really is only going over 1 or 2 threads at a time. And I first found it at the top of the Holst Victorian House Museum in Cheltenham. And when I saw it, I became aware that I'd seen this sampler design before. And so my research had started. And it set off questions in my mind about why were there repeats of this particular sampler design? What and where was the Cheltenham Female Orphan Asylum, and why were they producing such a distinctive design? At that point, I was working on schools' workshops in the local museum, the Wilson Museum, and I had seen these samplers before. So it just started me to wonder why they looked like they did. Well, Cheltenham Female Orphan Asylum was established in 1806 as a school of industry. Its purpose was to relieve some of the issues of the poor in Cheltenham. Now, if you don't know Cheltenham, if you've not been to Cheltenham in Gloucestershire, during the 19th century, it was a fast-growing health resort, a holiday resort for the health-reviving water that was discovered there. It was piped into spas and baths around the town. Wealthy, middle and upper class people would come and take the water, and this rapid growth caused the gap between the rich and poor to expand, leaving many to struggle. The school was established, the School of Industry was to provide training and education for young girls to become ladies' maids in the homes of the wealthy in Cheltenham. There was a shortage of domestic staff as people were coming into the town to spend time for their health and a holiday. In 1824, its name was changed to the Cheltenham Female Orphan Asylum, and its curriculum continued to focus on training for domestic service and needlework. Now, if you come to Cheltenham today, you can still take the waters. They're not very nice, and most people do only try it once. My research has been on a lot of the documents and ephemera that have been left behind. As with most 19th century institutions, it's left a record of its organisation. And for the orphanage, this takes the form of an annual report, ballot papers, and other ephemera. The annual reports contain lists of subscribers and patrons that supported the orphanage. And according to these reports, the orphanage would take about 20 to 35 orphans or half orphans. And in order to enter the orphanage, each girl would be sponsored by a subscriber to enter a ballot. In order to get onto that ballot paper, she had to comply with a whole list of regulations. First of all, the girl needed to be about age 7 or 8, not really much older than that. They had to be an orphan or half orphan. They had to provide their own baptism certificate, the marriage certificate of their parents, the death certificate of their parents, a letter from a parish priest confirming they were from a good family, a letter from a doctor to confirm good health. The girl nor her parents could have ever accepted poor relief or been in a workhouse. And once all this had been confirmed, the girls were then able to enter ballot to see if they're able to get a place at the orphanage. The ballot paper, as you can see on there, might contain 5 or 6 names, of which 2 or 3 girls would be offered a place at the orphanage. Some girls appear twice on the ballot papers in consecutive votes for their families and sponsors keen to get them in. If a girl didn't get into the orphanage, it's unclear what happened to her. She may have stayed with her family, surviving aunts, uncles, relatives, or it could have been entry into the workhouse. When we look at the census records, when we look at 1851, which of course starts to record the place of birth, it's possible to see where the girls were coming to come from this orphanage around the country. So this is indicative of the nature of Cheltenham at the time as a holiday resort. And girls are coming in from all around because people would find out about the good work that was happening at this orphanage and would return home and then may suggest a girl to come in. So on Tuesday afternoons, for example, it was possible to visit the orphanage as part of regular social visiting. So word of it did spread, but we can see there that the girls came from all around the country, the ones that are recorded on the 1861 census. The 2 circled points down towards the bottom, they're the staff in 1861. So that's Mary Folk and Margaret Morrison, who are the matron and the schoolmistress. There are descriptions to Cheltenham at this time, tourist guides, and it describes the orphanage as a committee room with a schoolroom, a large and small kitchens, pantry, scullery, and dormitories to sleep in. Plain furniture stood on plain stone and brick floors with small bedsteads with flock mattresses. The girls used wooden spoons and trenchers, and they wore a uniform of brown serge gowns, straw bonnets, capes, black shoes and stockings, white tippets, check bibs and aprons with Duffield cloaks. The girls started and ended each day with a religious service and an hour's reading and spelling practice each day as well. However, much of the day was taken with the task of all the skills needed to become a useful lady's maid. That's what the girls were training to be in there. This is a form of early vocational training. So the girls learnt the tasks needed to caring for each other at the orphanage, cleaning and lighting fires, laundering clothes, through a set routine each week, so that Thursdays, for example, were for cleaning the iron and the grates. All the skills that would be needed to enter a local household. They also learnt to sew, and they actually completed huge amounts of plain sewing for the household furnishings. As we know, the Victorian era is known for that huge expansion of cloth and furnishings used in the household, and the girls learnt the basics of dealing with all of these. The orphanage raised money through these skills, and so the work was brought into the orphanage to be sewn. And this is an example of the price list. In the annual reports, it's possible to see that the work would be completed and how much it was charged for it. For example, you can see here a fine shirt might cost 1 shilling and 6p up to 2 shillings and 6p, whereas a pinafore with sleeves might range from 3p to 6p. Hemming was 0.5 a yard, backstitch from 3/4 a yard, and knitting cost 2p per ounce. Further notes in the annual report explain that all work had to be cut out before it was sent in, with the greatness of exactness, otherwise extra would be charged for cutting out. And in one of the annual reports, there's a great deal of discussion about the amount of money that is raised by the girls in the needlework that they were doing, comparing it to other orphanages around the country. It wasn't just samplers they produced. This is an example of a pin cushion that was produced, a sort of commemorative pin cushion. The annual report showed that the income from this work was very high, and that the focus on domestic education focused on needlework, and actually shows that there was very little time on that housework. Other fundraising came from the annual sales of needlework, from which this pin cushion comes, and the sampler I showed you earlier. There seems to have been around about 8 variations of sampler and pin cushion designs that were being produced, each inscribed with a suitable Victorian motto and the name of the orphanage. The designs possibly came from Victorian periodicals rather than the designs from the girls themselves. The colours were always black and red, marking thread, though there is a pin cushion for the coronation of Queen Victoria that does have some colour in its design. So I've been able to follow some of the lives of the orphans as they came through the orphanage, to build up a picture of what was happening to those girls once they left the orphanage. So, for example, here is the life of Mary Gillett. She was baptised February the 10th, 1839, and she was daughter to William and Mary of the Sherborne Arms of Sherborne Street, Cheltenham. Now, it's not still a pub, but it does still have that sign up outside it. It's actually very close to the university, and it's also very close to the orphanage. The 1841 census has her living at the Sherborne Arms with her parents, William and Mary. She's aged 2. She has her sisters, Hannah, aged 5, Esther and Emma, twins, aged 8. Domestic servant called Elizabeth Baker is living with them also. But on March the 16th, 1845, it's recorded the death of her mother, Mary. Her mother was aged 43. So Mary, at the age of 8, is listed on the ballot paper in October 1847. And she's simply described, she's there at the bottom of the ballot paper, she's simply described as one of 5 children, her mother dead, and her father now reduced to great poverty. We can see the names of her sponsors who's recommending her to come in. And we can see some of the descriptions of some of the other girls coming in to the orphanage. She's unsuccessful in 1847. She doesn't make it in. She's listed again in April 1848, and this time she's successful at getting in. The next census in 1851, she's listed at the orphanage, age 12, and here she learns to sew, make up clothes in preparation for her life to be a lady's maid. In 1861, she's listed as a lady's maid, age 22, at the rectory in Shipton Moyne, which is in the south end of Gloucestershire. In 1871, she's listed as a teacher at Northampton Place Industrial School for Orphan Girls, which is over in Swansea. So she's graduated there up to being a teacher at an orphanage again, teaching those skills that she's learned. 1878, she's married to William Wilkinson, who's a watchmaker and a jeweler. 1881, she's living with him. 1891, again, still with William. He dies that year, and then she lives with her sister, Esther, in the 1901 census. I can't trace her any further than that. So Mary went to this orphanage to train to be his lady's maid, and it has to make us wonder what happened to her sisters who did not attend the orphanage. There are often cases of siblings coming into the orphanage, several families that come in at different stages. But it has been possible to trace Emma and Esther, her older twin sisters, on the census. And so we find that Emma is listed as a nursery nurse, and Esther's also a domestic servant. Her other sister Hannah marries a greengrocer, giving the impression of a similar life story and status. So the older sisters who did not go into the orphanage, but they were already old enough to be working as domestic staff in the town. So I mentioned that the designs seem to come from circulars, and here's one of Sir Matthew Hale's sampler, and this is a flyer produced by the SPCK, the Society for Promotion of Christian Knowledge, and the typology, I think that's the word, is almost so similar across the two pieces. I think it's a very good chance that this is what they were using for one of the designs. So the designs are relatively simple, and they often have this checkerboard around the outside, just simple black and red marking thread. Very occasionally there are samplers come up with girls' names in them, but it's very unusual. The vast majority of samplers that come out of the orphanage have no personal name on them. But using the methods of material culture, we can start to understand these objects in new ways. They were originally made and sold as a commemorative fundraising object, possibly to be displayed as an example of the acceptable form of middle-class philanthropy. They now communicate much more about the institution than it did the girls that made them. Each piece has similar characteristics, and if we start to describe them, we might use the words of small, neat, regular, well made, pious in its outlook, with very few materials used in the construction. Remember, these are only about 15 centimetres or 6 inches square. It's anonymous, and there's very little sign of the girl who made it. When we consider that these girls were training to be ladies' maids, that very specific personal role that would support a middle-class woman in everyday habits, helping her to dress, mend, repair the clothes and undergarments, and helping take care of personal needs, we understand it as the intimate role of a carer. The characteristics of the embroidery might be the characteristics that you would require from a lady's maid. You might imagine that you would choose a lady's maid that is neat and careful with materials, a lady's maid that's anonymous and pious and understands her place. So the sampler represents those values that the institution is instilling into the girls rather than the designs from the girls themselves. Now, Cheltenham's not the only institution that had a certain look to their samplers, and we can find other schools locally, even down into Bristol, and Quaker schools that have a certain look about them. And it almost as an early form of branding that represents the institution that the girls are part of, and they become quite easily identifiable as a group or a set. So as part of my research, I've been offered the opportunity to curate a series of interventions. I'm also an artist, and the making of objects is something very important to my practice. And so I've displayed these in the Holst Victorian House Museum. The museum is the birthplace of Gustav Holst, famous for writing The Planets, and it's a period home set to the 1870s. It's less than 200 yards from the site of the orphanage, so it's well placed for an exhibition. And with generous support of collectors of orphanage work, needlework from the university archives, it's one of the very early teacher training colleges in England. And the support of a local museum, I've collected together a wide range of working class needlework and plain sewing samplers. As an artist and maker, I've also remade items from 19th century manuals, such as the Workwoman Guide, and made new pieces of work that explore the narrative and life of the orphan and the lady's maid within the 19th century middle class home. This is some of the examples of the pieces that I've laid. In the top left, you can see some of those items set within the parlour to create the idea of the tension between the middle class and working class values. Elsewhere, I've rearranged some of the displays. Down in the scullery, I've used photographs of ladies' maids and some of the quotes from them to put displays around the home. So the exhibition is called Making, Mending, Marking, and it is open. It's now open, and it's open until the beginning of February. If you'd like to know a little and much more about it, I was also interviewed on the podcast Haptic and Hue by Jo Andrews. I also do some research for her, and I'm on episode 25. Okay, that's come to the end. I stop sharing, and I wonder if anybody's got any questions. Otherwise, I do have a couple of events to promote. Veronica said that I could through my community work. But yes, if there's any question.
Absolutely, thank you so much, Jo. So Anna will lead on the questions. If you want, whilst people are thinking of questions, if you wanted to just explain about those events, Jo, that might be a good follow-on. And then Anna, if you're happy to take the helm.
Absolutely, I'll pick it up.
Sure. So as part of my research, I've been developing a lot of research locally in Gloucestershire about textiles. And as part of that, I am working with an organisation called Voices Gloucester that seeks to celebrate the heritage and culture in Gloucester in so many different ways. I'm leading on one of their strategic projects, which is about how we explore our heritage and culture through textiles, through cloth and costume. This year we are we're producing a 3-part project, one of which is here being made that way, which is the costume of Gloucester, where we've worked collaboratively with many stitchers and sewers around the city to create panels that are being sewn onto a costume that celebrate the history. That is going to be exhibited in the cathedral in Gloucester from the 15th to the 30th of September. Another exhibition will be there at the same time, which I'm curating, which looks at the clothing of Gloucester. We've put out a public call to people for clothing that celebrates the history and culture of Gloucester, and tells it through the everyday clothing of people. So, for example, we have got an amazing pair of jeans that somebody feels absolutely fabulous in, but they were bought by them as a teenager in the city. We've got clothing from one of the first women rugby referees. We have a great rugby tradition in Gloucester. I'm one of the first women rugby referees. We've got ecclesiastical clothing, we've got celebratory clothing, we've got queer clothing, and we're putting those into the cathedral to tell the life of the city through the clothing of everyday people. This culminates in a 2-day symposium, non-academic symposium, on how we relate to clothing and costume. We have 2 days of free talks. The tickets can be found on the Voices Gloucester website. And those talks range from 14th century dye recipes through how to wear a sari. We have Amy Twigger-Holroyd coming to give a talk on her research. And we have Professor Tim Parry-Williams coming over from Bergen University to talk about Anglo-Norwegian cloth trade, because Gloucestershire has a great deal of cloth that it was exported around the world. I'm sure many of you know. And that's happening on the 29th and 30th of September at a place called The Folk in Gloucester. And tickets are on the Voices Gloucester website under the threads, and it is www.voicesgloucester.org.uk. There we go. I've been practicing that. We had a radio thing today, and I've been practicing getting it all out as quick and concise as possible.
That was amazing, Jo. Thank you so much. You really got those ideas across really easily. So questions have been coming in, and it looks from my sort of initial look in the chat that people are really fascinated by the anonymity of the sewn pieces that you've uncovered, the samplers, the pincushions, and this very kind of standardized aesthetic which was put upon them through this evangelical Christian mindset and the actual lives that you are starting to retrieve who created these. And I think this is an area, there won't be anyone in the room who isn't fascinated in this. This idea of retrieval and putting a name to something that was forcibly anonymized. So yeah.
Yes, what I've really enjoyed, and what I've really enjoyed doing in the museum is elevating those working class stories. So, for example, in one of the rooms, the lady of the house, her room, whenever you visit the museum, you have to remember there's a dual narrative going on, because they're still working on the life of Gustav Holst, but we have woven in and around it this alternative narrative about the life of girls in the orphanage. So what I've tried to do is elevate some of that working class labour. So, for example, the ladies of the house, her room, we normally see it with the bed made and clothing packed neatly away, and the room is ready prepared. But we've reset that room, showing the working class labour. The fire is not ready, the carpets need beating, the bed isn't made. And I've been lucky enough to be in the museum while visitors and volunteers are coming in. And there's almost a wincing at the idea of walking into that private space. But that's the labour that the working classes are doing. We're all used to walking into a National Trust property or a historic home and seeing, for example, the dining room groaning with plastic fruit, telling the story of a meal that's about to happen. But that's the story of the working class family. That's the story of the middle classes in that room. And when we stop and think about the amount of labour that's gone in to set that table, there's huge amounts. And so by changing the narrative to be the working class labour, to elevate the lives and stories, it's really quite powerful in that space. We're used to seeing it in the kitchen, in the scullery, and yet the whole house was actually a place of working class labour. And that's been great fun to do, and really great to see people's reactions to it. Yeah, the vast majority of pieces are anonymous, apart from a couple that are in private hands. I don't know who stitched which pieces. I just know what girls were there at the time at which they stitched them. And so part of the display also explores the life of some of those orphans, to try and put the names, I can't ever precisely, but to put that story back into those pieces.
Populate them as best you can.
Yes,
Do you have any specific church intervention in this story? I mean, were there particular churches or church people who had a particular kind of direct interest and control over the output?
Yes, they were, and it's one of those sort of circular pieces of research. There's only 2 annual reports that I can use, but the earlier annual report has the involvement of Reverend Francis Close. Now, here in Cheltenham, he's quite an important character, partly because he was the person that founded the teacher training college that then went on to be the university. And he's quite an evangelical vicar at the main church in Cheltenham at that time. It was a relatively small place when he first arrived, much bigger by the time he left. And he rages against this party town. Cheltenham is known for its waters. It's also known for a famous horse race called the Gold Cup, onto which middle classes are obviously betting and gambling. And he rages against these things and wants to challenge Cheltenham as a party town. If people are here for their health, they should be here for their health and for nothing else. And he is the chair of one of the committees. There are 2 committees that run the orphanage, a committee of superintendents and the committee of management. The committee of management is an all-female committee, women on their running. They look after the day-to-day running of the orphanage. And then there's the committee of superintendents, which is an all-male committee, and they are obviously looking after the budget and the building and things like that. And he is the chair of the committee for a very long time, and so his influence is coming through to create an almost convent-like establishment where the girls are being kept safe, protected, visiting on a Tuesday afternoon. The only men that can visit have to be accompanied by members of the committee and things like that. So yeah, very controlled, very controlled. In no way is it solving the problem of the poor in 19th century Cheltenham. There's still a workhouse, but it does run at a profit because it is this acceptable form of philanthropy being led by Reverend Francis Close.
Interesting. So Z is asking, have any girls managed to sneak their name onto a sampler and somehow personalize their work?
So there are 2 samplers in private collection that have names on there, and I'm able to match those up with the girls. Now there is, at one point, it is possible for girls to pay, their families to pay to come in. They do not need to be an orphan or a half orphan. They can come in and pay £10 a year. And we're talking about working class families paying to essentially train their girls up into a role. I don't know whether those 2 with names were orphans, or whether, when we think about the purpose of these pieces, when we think that they're being sold for fundraising at bazaars and fetes, then it makes more sense that there's no name on there, because would you have bought a sampler with a name on at that time, or would you have just wanted an anonymous piece? So maybe they put their names on them to keep, and then they would move on to these fundraising ones, and so there were not names on it. I think we have to think about one of the purposes of them being sold. But I'm particularly fond of Mary Gillett's story. If you come to the museum, you'll see I give a great deal of focus, and I'd like to think that maybe we're displaying a piece of her work, but that's only my fancy.
Okay, Kim's asking about your approach to the term intervention, role in shaping your research and the world of practice-based creative work. What's the relationship?
So some of the interventions I've done is by using the manuals from the 19th century that I have found, such as the Workwoman's Guide, and creating pieces that people can handle within the space. I think so often with textiles, we struggle because they're behind glass. They have to be protected, they have to last, but the very tactile nature of them, we want to touch them and hold them. And so I've used a chance to recreate pieces as close as I can, so that people can handle them and understand that relationship between the feel of the object and how we learn from it. So that's really where my practice has been around that, trying to build an understanding of sensory archaeology, how the touch and handling of the cloth can connect us to that story, and we then learn in a different way. I've tried to choose quite a playful approach to the interventions, and people are encouraged to pick up and handle and explore. I originally trained as a primary school teacher, so I really understand the need for us to explore objects through different ways other than just looking or reading, and so I tried to bring in that approach, a sensory approach, to get people to engage with the exhibition.
Fascinating.
Thank you, Jo, and thank you, Anna. Is there one more question? We've got time for one more, and then we need to bring on our next.
Let's have a look. There are quite a few questions. The chat's really interesting. I mean, one very simple one. Claire's asking, how long did the orphanage exist? How long was it in operation?
Okay. Yeah, it's a long time, actually. It's opened in 1806, and it goes on. The actual building is demolished in 1958. It's a very long-running orphanage. It obviously turns into a children's home, and there are both boys and girls there. It's but it is in the 1940s that it starts to be for both. It lasts a long time. It has the patronage of Queen Charlotte, Queen Victoria, Queen Alexandra, and I believe it's the only orphanage in the country that had that. But yeah, it's a long-running orphanage.
Amazing. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I'm sorry to interject. Joe, do have a look in the chat, 'cause there's lots of comments about your paper and responses to some of the points we've been discussing, which are really interesting. And I think the anonymity and the idea of wanting to put your mark on something you've made is an interesting debate that's filtering through. I also tried to add some links to some of the places you were mentioning, but if I've got any of them wrong or you want to add anything to those links in the chat, please do, Joe. But thank you. That was a fantastic way to kick off this afternoon. And we now move on to our second and equally wonderful speaker, Deirdre Morgan. And Deirdre is going to be talking to us on a subject entitled Pants, Performance and Perception, amazing alliteration, the impact of New York's disguise law 1845 on gendered dress. And just to give you a bit of background to Deirdre, she received her BFA in theatre production design with a concentration in costume, hair and makeup design from Montclair State University. Her career led her around the world, styling wigs in styling wigs in the cruise ship industry and assisting costume designers around the tri-state area. She found a home in New York City and established herself freelancing as a theatrical dresser, assistant designer, and makeup artist, working with brands such as Charlotte Tilbury and productions of Jersey Boys, New World Stages, Come From Away, Broadway, and most recently Leopoldstadt on Broadway. She recently graduated from the Fashion Institute of Technology's Fashion and Textile History Theory and Museum Practice Masters Program, which is now chaired by the wonderful Hilary Davidson. And her research interests, this is Deirdre's research interests, lie in the intersection of gender and feminist theory and the history of gendered fashion. And we have a really exciting paper ahead. Deirdre, I'm going to hand over to you and let you take over the screen.
Great, thank you. Okay, thank you so much for having me today. I'm really excited to share this research that I've been working on. So today I am presenting the research from my master's qualifying paper, which was titled Pants, Performance and Perception, the Impact of New York's Disguise Law on Gendered Dress. Through my research, I wanted to center two people, a civilian and a performer, to analyze the public perception of gendered dress in the 19th century, considering the increase in disguise laws, which were also known as cross-dressing or masquerade laws, throughout the United States during the same period. The two people who became the focus for this paper were Ella Wessner, the vaudeville performer, and a person named Charlie, who appeared in an article in the New York Daily Times in 1856, and was found to be presenting in a way that did not align with what was believed to be their socially assigned gender. As seen on the slide currently on view, there's a photograph of Ella Wessner in one of her costumes and a description of Charlie from that New York Daily Times article. My paper aimed to explore how personal expression through dress was suppressed in the 19th century, while gender impersonation was celebrated as entertainment, while using Charlie and Ella Wessner as a lens to examine how fashion plays a role in the construction of gender. And by examining two people who existed outside the scope of traditional fashion scholarship, this paper also explored issues of erasure and visibility in the making of history. So I'm now going to take you through a very brief exploration of my paper, first talking about New York's disguise law. So throughout the second half of the 19th century, the United States saw a rise in several types of legislation, particularly obscenity laws, local purity campaigns, and cross-dressing laws. This was a time where ideas about homosexuality and ideas about morality took hold of the American middle class. And cross-dressing laws were becoming part of a larger social discussion regarding what was called appropriate gender behavior. So during this time, there was an examination of femininity and masculinity, and becomes a really defining time for the gender binary and the social codes associated with gender expression. By the 1880s and into the 20th century, the regulation of sexual and gender expression went to trial at the municipal, state, and national levels, resulting in an array of criminal and civil penalties to suppress gender and sexual variation. These cross-dressing laws were passed in as many as 58 cities and at least 2 states. And they all contained the same principle. They forbade a person from appearing in public in a dress not belonging to his or her sex. These laws eventually prohibited people from disguising or masking their assigned sex at birth, leading to a surge in policing the way people chose to present themselves in public. The first official New York law targeting cross-dressing was passed in January of 1845, and I'm going to read the quote here. It made being masked or in any manner disguised by unusual or unnatural attire or facial alteration, loiters, remains, or congregates in a public place with other persons so masked or disguised, or knowingly permits or aids persons so masked or disguised to congregate in a public place, a criminal violation. When the law was initially passed, it actually was not meant to target those participating in what would come to be known as gender deviance. The law was passed after several years of dispute between tenant farmers and law enforcement, as seen in the newspaper clip on the slide. Farmers were disguising themselves as Native Americans and would drive away rent collectors and burn eviction notices. So then in retaliation, sheriffs would ransack their homes in search of these costumes. The back and forth would eventually lead to this law being passed. However, due to the language used in the law, it gave police license to surveil, harass, and arrest New Yorkers wearing unusual or unnatural attire, ultimately leading to this law being used to target those who existed outside of social norms and in marginalized communities. By 1876, the disguise law was amended to allow for disguises at masquerade or fancy dress balls if police permission were obtained. So with the laws policing people's public gender expression, and obscenity laws maintaining a moral code for people's entertainment, it is surprising that gender impersonators in vaudeville grew to be some of the most prominent actors in New York City and across the United States. These performances were viewed as a wholesome entertainment, quite suitable for middle-class women and children, with the occasional complaint. These acts were meant to astonish the audience, creating illusions. As the style of entertainment was taking hold and gender boundaries were crossed for entertainment purposes, the public and private spheres for people began to lose shape when entertainment was involved. Crossing gender boundaries was viable entertainment, but once the curtain came down, so did the illusion that the gender boundary could be crossed in public. The law was not the only place where cross-dressing was frowned upon. I found an instance in an etiquette book by author L.G. Abel titled Woman and Her Various Relations, published in 1851. It contains practical rules for American females with methods for dinner parties, hints on the body, mind, and character, and has an entire chapter dedicated to L.G. Abel's thoughts on women wearing male attire. The chapter begins reading, quote, "There needs no argument on this subject. Editors may no longer trouble themselves to use their flattering arts to duper the frailer half of the race. Woman, if she is rightly educated and is what every true-minded female will be, has enough of her own inherent delicacy and modesty to debar her forever from dressing in the attire of the opposite sex," end quote. Abel's book was published during a period that feminist historians have dubbed the cult of pure womanhood or the cult of domesticity, where social values held in the American middle class were attributed to the way women were expected to present themselves. Historian Barbara Welter coined the phrase the cult of true womanhood in her 1966 essay by the same title. Welter writes, quote, "If anyone, male or female, dared to tamper with the complex of virtues which made up true womanhood, he was damned immediately as an enemy of God. It was a fearful obligation, a solemn responsibility, which the 19th century American woman had to uphold the pillars of the temple with her frail white hand," end quote. The ideas put forth by the cult of true womanhood were heavily intertwined with religion and expressed the differences between what was quoted as true women versus women who were not conforming. After contextualizing the social climate through the mid-19th century, I then considered Charlie and Ella Wessner's public treatment, finding a clear distinction between the way Charlie was viewed as a civilian wearing men's clothes, whereas Ella Wessner was seen as an eccentric performer. The social norms surrounding gender that were enforced by cross-dressing laws not only aided in the social construction of gender and the ability to visually identify someone and make a judgment about them, but it created what sociologist Claire Sears describes as a series of belongings. It creates the idea that items of clothing belong to a specific sex, types of people belong in public spaces, and types of bodies belong in the categories of man and woman. So in Charlie's case, they were arrested because of vagrancy for having been out of work for about 2 months. Once it became apparent after the arrest that Charlie was, quote, disguised, the cross-dressing law was utilized as a threat for more severe punishment should they not meet the requirements of the court. The moral framework that the religious society created made it so when Charlie was arrested, it wasn't as simple as them needing to find work, as they very clearly wanted to do to avoid scrutiny. But because of who they were in the eyes of society, they should never have been working or wearing men's clothes to begin with. Because Wessner was creating an illusion and entertainment, she was received by the public differently than women or female presenting people who chose to dress themselves in male attire, either to affirm a gender disparity within themselves or to pursue the ability to make more money without the job structure set forth for women in the mid-19th century. The binary view of gender as being wholly feminine or masculine and the roles those labels laid out for society was constructed from a view of gender that predates the 19th century and continues into modern day. As fashion historians continue to unveil the complicated history of those who existed on the fringes of society, as well as what was happening in mainstream fashion, it is imperative to the contextualization of history to share the stories of the queer community and how they have been given either no space in history or their stories have been given heterosexual narratives. Before I conclude, I do want to note that I was very conscious of the language I would need to use throughout my paper and spend a significant amount of time considering how a 21st century historian with their own biases and lived experiences could write about people who existed in history without putting labels or definitions on them that they themselves did not initiate. I wanted to be very conscious that I was not surmising the sexuality or gender orientation of Charlie or Ella Wessner. While some people who chose to not conform to social dress codes may have been part of the LGBTQIA2S+ community, this does not apply to everyone who chose to defy dress codes. There were two researchers whose work became invaluable to me when considering my framework: Kit Hyam, author of Before We Were Trans, and Jonathan Michael Square, who has dedicated his career to studying images and stories of enslaved people and considering how those stories disrupt the, quote, easy narratives that history has given us. Both of their work shaped how I thought about the language I wanted to use for my paper, as well as the presentation of two people's stories who have not been told by them directly. My paper is completed and available on ProQuest under the same title as my presentation today. And I'll just finish with my contact information and where you can find me on social media. Thank you.
Thank you. That was fascinating. I was just asking your tutor Hilary, was like, is the paper available online? She literally just went, it's on ProQuest, and then you said it was on ProQuest because fantastic research. Obviously I have to admit a slight bias as someone who researches from the other side, the theatre side, so this is really good, useful context for me. Whilst people are thinking of their questions, Anna, I'll wait for you to pop your camera on so you can take them on. We've got I think we've got a few trickling to the chat, but if anyone has questions, please do add them to the chat. As Deirdre said, you can find her paper on ProQuest. I might try and find that link and pop it in the chat if you would be okay with that, Deirdre, just while you're talking.
Absolutely.
I think I don't think I'll be alone in those who'd like to know more. Are we getting some questions through, Anna? I think I saw one.
So questions are coming in, but I think people are sort of it's made us all think,
digesting, yeah.
And thinking about how to phrase and what actually to ask. So Robin is wondering about skin and about tattooing, and I wonder if you can say a little bit more about this. Did this go hand in hand with this community, or is this something else completely different?
So I actually sorry, I asked the question really terribly. It was while you were talking about the laws being imposed and the masquerading, and I kind of jumped in and I was like, I wonder if tattooing history has anything mixed up into this. So I didn't ask the question very well in there. I just was like, tattooing.
Gotcha.
So.
Gotcha. I actually have not come across, at least in the truncated amount of research I was doing, any information on tattoos, but that would definitely be sort of like a sideline I'd be interested in pursuing now that I kind of have a baseline of everything.
Okay, so Z is asking, have you found people who purposefully identified as gender non-conforming in this time period? What kind of labels or identities do people use at the time, if you know?
So I personally have not found anybody that said that they were gender nonconforming. There's certainly, like, through analysis, seems like there was a community in different parts of the United States. There's this really incredible book by Hugh Ryan called When Brooklyn Was Queer that specifically looks at the queer community in Brooklyn from just before the 19th century-ish and then through the 20th century. And there's all these little markers of things people would do, things people would say, jobs people would take that marked them as potentially being queer. But there's a lot to unpack as far as like whether they would have been arrested or kicked out of their homes and found a place to live. So it's a really hard road to navigate, especially as like people living in the 21st century who have these sort of labels in our heads that we look for, and finding ways to decode this historical language people were using.
Interesting. So Sharon is asking, thinking about the project of getting clothing in the mid-19th century, could one actually buy clothing for oneself or family members? And some people could make their own, of course. So how would you dress yourself? What's the practicalities of getting dressed if you were presenting in a particular way that didn't quite align with what was available?
So it definitely seems like people were making their own clothes. In the article about Charlie that I found, the description of their clothing is that it looked very well made and well tailored. It looked exactly like it was for them, not that they had taken it from somebody or that it had been made for a man's body shape and then fit onto the body shape associated with women. And so there was a time where Charlie was found up in Boston with another person who was arrested for cross-dressing. And they talked about this shop that they were working in Boston. And so that's sort of an avenue I need to see, if there were these sort of like underground stores that had public fronts that allowed people to make their own clothes. And then for somebody like Ella Wessner, she had actually worked for a gender impersonator as a seamstress. So when looking at her clothes, there's definitely this costume aspect to it. Like the lapel is a little bit wider than a normal person's would be. The cuffs are more accentuated, so that from a stage, there's this theatricality to it. But you can see that she understands proportion and how to create this illusion on her own body. So there is this like making history that I'm still trying to uncover as well.
It's really fascinating. So Kay sees this is a very timely conversation to be having, considering the culture wars ongoing in the US at the moment regarding drag, and in the parts of the world as well. Kim is asking whether the dress reform movement intersected with this particular history. Were the communities interrelated in any way? Was there a sense of ideas crossing over from one to another? What's your perspective?
So the dress reformers, from the perspective of people like Charlie, because Charlie does mention the dress reformers in their interview, they view it as like these women are allowed to dress outside of dictated dress codes and are getting a little bit of flack for it, but they're not being really arrested for dressing a specific way. Whereas Charlie is like, I'm working, I am making a way for myself. I've just fallen on hard times, and you just want to arrest me because I don't look the way you think I should. And they do make a dig at the dress reformers, saying that their clothing doesn't really look that good. And like, doesn't my clothes look really well made? And don't I look like a man? And so there is this sort of disparity between what was happening with the dress reformers in society versus what was happening with people who were essentially, and what I surmise as, trying to find a way to express themselves through their clothing.
I'm really interested in how Ella and Charlie were received. I mean, what were they subject to vitriolic comments? Was there acceptance? Was there astonishment? I mean, how did it go down?
So the article about Charlie in the New York Daily Times is really fascinating because it's this one reporter who very clearly has their own thoughts about the way Charlie dresses and what Charlie's doing as just like living their life. And I am surprised by the amount of Charlie that seems to be seeping through in this interview. And so from that interview, Charlie seems like somebody that people associate with like, why don't you just conform? Why do you feel the need to dress this way? Why can't you just live life as a woman and do your womanly things instead of dating women and making women fall in love with you because you look like an attractive man? And sort of pushing this gender, quote unquote, agenda, as people like to say here in the United States, to sort of keep a status quo. Where Ella was this eccentric performer, I was not able to find any indication that they were ever arrested or threatened with arrest for the way that they were dressing. Ella was also known to wear men's clothing in public and off stage. She had a very public lesbian relationship, and she traveled across the world. She performed in England and France and was well received at every place she went. That's not to say that she didn't receive any criticism, but it was in her will that she wanted to be buried in men's clothes, and she was buried in men's clothing. And so there's definitely this disparity between this like very public figure who was living an eccentric lifestyle and had sort of a shtick, versus somebody who very clearly just wanted to go live their life and be left alone.
Interesting. So Veronica's put a link in the chat to your research, where to find your writing. Robin's mentioned Matt Lodder about people interested in the history of tattooing. Veronica, I think this is a great suggestion, has put in, have a look at Tipping the Velvet, Sarah Waters' fictionalized accounts of, is it this time period or is it later?
It's a bit later. It's sort of the turn of the 19th century, sort of setting from the 1890s onwards. The kind of it is much more theatrical to start with, and then goes across into the world that Deirdre's exploring, which is kind of the angle I've come from stage round, and I think you've come from the other way, which is really exciting. Yeah, and it starts with very much stagecraft, and then into how might you translate that into your life. So almost what Deirdre was saying could have happened in the case of at least one of these people in terms of how they learn how to make their clothes, adapt them for their body, etc. But it's beautifully well written, and I think, if I'm right, and anyone who knows, correct me if I'm wrong, it did emerge from Waters' doctoral research, because it's very rich in terms of its detail of the world that it goes into. And I know she's not a dress historian, but she gets the dress right, which is so nice.
You're right.
So I do recommend that.
And in fact, Veronica also says, I think we need to create a recommended reading list to share with the group. I agree with that.
Yes, I'm making a note of that. Could be a resource we create in the longer term, just because we keep getting all these great suggestions. We need to capture them.
Kate's suggesting that Fanny and Stella is also an interesting non-fiction read. Okay, Chris has pointed out the one sphere where I've noticed 19th and early 20th century trans dressing is in mourning clothing. There are a number of reports of men dressing as widows. Okay, so the veil was thought to prevent recognition and no one would challenge a widow's identity. Usually the height and gait were clues that the person underneath the veil was male, which is a provocative thought.
Yeah, and going along that line of thinking definitely translates to this idea of thought that has been around for a while, considering the burqa and hijab, where many people don't want people that wear those to travel with them, because there's this thought that they could be disguising themselves or hiding. So, and I think that goes back a little further, because I remember in one of my classes, we were talking about the veils in Spain, and the idea that people could disguise themselves under their veil, and it left a very sort of seedy thought in society, and definitely feels like it has bled through the centuries.
Fascinating. Right. Well, I think we've actually we've done so well with our discussions and had such fascinating papers. We haven't got as much time as I thought we might have originally to sort of share work in progress and general research joy. But one of the things I thought we could do to conclude today's session, because it's all been about sharing research from within the student community, but also more widely, just anyone who's doing research in general, is if anyone wanted to add anything to the chat or just briefly pop their camera on and talk about projects they're working on, either just to share the research joy or to ask for advice. We'd really love to hear from everyone who wants to do that. So does anyone have any research they want to share? And maybe, I think Robin, you bold. Oh, Kate has something. Kate first, and then maybe Robin. I think she's working on something now. Kate, go for it.
Oh, well, I just have, so I am working at the moment on, I'm trying to find out something about Firmin and Sons Limited in Birmingham, the button manufacturers. And so if anybody, I know that part of their archive is located in the Westminster City archives, but for one of the oldest firms to be making buttons ongoing continuously in Britain, they're surprisingly, they've got their sales manager who is also / archivist, and it's not really his thing. So if anyone knows about how I might find out a bit more about Firmins, or if they've come across anything, that would be lovely.
Sounds amazing. Can you pop their name in the chat, Kate, so we've got the spelling?
Sure.
And I see Zach has written, looking into the role of dress and body image in the Malleus Maleficarum. Not sure where it will go yet. Oh, wow, this is exciting. Thank you, Kate. So we've got Kate's is a question. Anyone who knows about Firmin and Sons Limited or can help trace that. And this is the kind of question you can also send to our email group, our GISC mail group as well. Please do feel you can use that as a way to ask questions or share what you're working on. Robin, are you keen to share what you've been working on during this meeting, actually?
Well, it's actually embarrassing in a way, because I'm doing my first ever embroidery. And it's because I'm gonna do one of the making historical dress workshops, the second workshop, which is at Cheltenham House. So I'm super excited to have an excuse to finally go there. But because this video I had done with American Duchess apparently inspired this Instagram challenge, dress reform challenge. And I always wanted to go back and look at it as sort of like my own research impact of like people making dresses based on a video that I randomly did with people, but then also making one myself, even though I wrote a whole PhD on it. I've never actually made an artistic dress. And the dressmaking part's easy, but suddenly learning to embroider is a kick. So like I do have the amazing Lynn Holst of our team, who is being my mentor and all kinds of stuff. But I'm even just trying to figure out like, what's the best way to, this is a practice. This is not going to be the dress. This is the practice for the yoke. And I'm sitting here like embarrassed because Joe's like obviously an expert. I'm sure there's many other experts in the room, but I'm like, am I even doing this right? Like I've got some paper down and I'm poking through the paper and maybe I should draw it on the linen. But I mean, it is fascinating and I'm loving doing it. And I'm thinking like, this is something I should have learned years ago, because I'm actually really, the whole sewing thing's been slightly duck to water for me, although I'm far from perfect. And I would like to, I don't know, obviously I want to get better at it, but I was literally like awake at 3 a.m, all of a sudden trying to think through like a puzzle of technique. So normally I'd be awake at 3 a.m. worrying about my life. But last night I was awake at 3 a.m. thinking about my embroidery, which was a really nice change. But anyway, so yeah, I tend to just have a go at things and not fuss about them being perfect anyway. But if anybody's got any tips on the best way to transfer a pattern down and not ruin your fabric in a way that's sort of like late 19th, early 20th century authentic, I'm very happy to hear that.
Fantastic. Okay, do you have a response to that?
Well, yeah, only So the thing, I've never tried it with the paper before, but I tend to do the you can get the transfer paper and the wheel. So that's what I use. And that I've never tried it with the paper because I don't know, for me, I imagine it might the paper might feel like it kind of gets in the way of the fabric a bit in terms of your like the haptic side of it. So yeah, I find the transfer paper and the wheel, the little pin wheel, is then you've got that closer connection with the fabric.
I love that. I might get some and give it a go. Lynn suggested a fine tissue. This is actually dressmaking paper that I have.
Okay.
And I sketched it on. So it's actually not as transparent or thin. It's a bit heavier than I would do in the end, but I just did it to kind of figure this out. And so I'm sort of doing the outlines and the couching on the lines. And then I was going to tear it off and do satin stitch and etc. But I was going to see how crap it was once I tore it off. I suspect it will be. So that is a good shout. I mean, what
tension a bit.
Huh?
I think it might affect the tension of the stitches a bit, but I would definitely, that's what I find easier because you haven't got anything interfering.
Have you considered using a pencil? Just to put your pencil?
Yes, I did. I have dressmakers pencils, I have pens, I thought about fabric, water soluble, like all of that stuff. Dissolving tissue as well. I mean, this is it. I've thought through all the different things, but the problem is, or not so much a problem, sorry, I don't mean to dominate this, but I'll just say, Lynn has very kindly sent me absolutely beautiful silk thread for the final project. So I don't have any plans of like washing it or doing or I might have to do something, but I'm trying to avoid anything that is going to require me to wash around the silk once it's down.
You've got some more tips in the chat, Robin. So do have a look. And Anna, there was another question that came through. Well, Anna had a question, so I'll read out Anna's question. And Anna, a question came through Joe. So maybe if I read out yours and then you read out the one for Joe. So Anna's general question, which people can meditate on unless they've got an immediate response, is whether anyone has come across a list or database listing where plantations in the USA source their UK textiles to dress the enslaved. So if anyone's come across a database like that, Anna would love to hear from you. And then Anna, I don't know, did you see that question for Joe that popped into the chat from Stephanie?
Yeah, there's quite a few. Let's have a look. Okay. Stephanie is asking, can I ask Joe how the museum visitors react to the presentation of the rooms as not perfectly presented? Do they engage with them? More or less than the dinner party setting idea that has become usual in the display. So what's a kind of visitor response to this?
Interestingly, the volunteers of the museum, I have to keep stopping them from tidying things up because a couple of places, the unmade bed and things like that. So once I explained it to the volunteers, they were fine. But I do have to stop people tidying it up. Some of the comments we've had back about the ladies' room, which is essentially the one that is not straight, and I couldn't take it as much as I wanted to, because obviously we're in a museum setting, so it's messy, but it's not really ready for cleaning. Is people feel quite uncomfortable stepping into that room, and it does feel like people have said that it feels sort of historically like there's not much space between themselves and the people that had been using the room. They feel a bit closer to them, because I think there is that feeling of where a bed is unmade, you can almost physically feel that space is different. I was struck by this. One of the reasons that I chose to do this was in response to some of the settings in Dennis Sever's house in Spitalfields. And one of the things that I found particularly profound was that idea of an unmade bed, that was the space that you came out of. So it's a bit early to say whether people are engaging with it in a different way, and I'm not there, and it's not part of my work to take people's responses. I'm only going on anecdotally when, you know, we've talked to people while they're moving around the space while we're setting up, and people have come in on a research viewing. But there is this sort of almost physical uncomfortableness when they set into the room. But that's as far as we've got really with it.
That's brilliant. And I think it's really interesting to think about that discomfort. Kim, your question for Deirdre is really good. I'm just wondering, it might be one that she might, but I know I would want time to think about. Or she's responded already. Why did I think Deirdre would struggle?
I also put my email in there because I realized it's a huge question. So anyone else who's here present who has some thoughts about this, because I'm working on a semi-new project about the politics of beauty, and I'm trying to connect 19th century context with the present in some weird way. So feel free to reach out, anyone with sources in the future, if you have anything.
Yeah.
Or
just for the recordings, I've realized that not people watching back won't be able to read the questions. The question was, big question for Deirdre or anyone else. How do we reconcile histories of feminism that may be seen as essentialist or centering politicizing biology with increasingly complex theorizing about gender identity? Any recent links to research authors or current popular sources welcome. And Kim has popped her email in the chat there. And Deirdre, yeah, you've already responded brilliantly to that. I think it's something we're all trying to be increasingly mindful of. And as you've demonstrated so brilliantly with your paper, we bring this 21st century perspective to the past that we cannot avoid, and we kind of need to be very conscious of. And you're dealing with that beautifully in your research. And both you and Joe presented really compelling presentations today that I'm so grateful to you for sharing with us. We could keep going for ages, but I think we probably should start drawing things to a close, not least because some of you have been up very early to be here today. So I think you deserve a rest. Just for those who are still with us, and we will share these details through our mailing list, our next event, because we're not having one in August, although Z might be hosting a sewing circle, so that might be something to look forward to. But our next event will be on the 24th of September on the Sunday, and it's going to focus around the idea of fragrance and that connection with dress and textiles and material culture as an evoker of memories, as something that's part of the production of textiles, etc. If you have anything that within your research that connects to that, please do reach out to us. Otherwise, we look forward to you joining us in the audience for that event. And thank you so much again to our speakers today and to our committee members who've helped support me today, and to our audience who've joined us. We hope you've enjoyed it as much as we have, and we look forward to seeing you in September. And I will now stop the recording.